Good afternoon to our viewers in Europe and good morning to our viewers in the United States. I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and I'd like to thank you for joining us for the latest installment of our virtual series titled Superwahljahr 2024. With this series, we've been looking at some of the important elections taking place around the world. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Nicolai von Ondarza. He is the head of the EU and Europe Research Division at the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik, or the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. And we're going to be talking about the European election, which took place from June 6th to the 9th. Nicolai, herzlich willkommen. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So even though the votes have been tallied and we have the results of the election, it seems as if the dust is still settling on last weekend's election across Europe. Voter turnout was a little higher than many people expected. And interestingly enough, the polls were more accurate than many people anticipated. Were you at all surprised by last weekend's European election results?
So I think overall, as you said, the results were mostly in line with the polling and what we expected. So there were very few huge surprises between the 27 EU member states. In some, for instance, the far right did a little bit better, in some a little bit worse. If you look at individual countries, you might find one or two surprises, but really overall, I think the story was as expected, a rise of the right, many gains for the center right, some gains for the far right, but overall this very strong shift to the right. But I would say, secondly, it's always different to have polling than to have results. And some of the results, even though the polling were spot on, really shocked the individual member states. France is probably the most prominent example where the polling was spot on, but still you saw a shocked President Macron calling the snap elections and really sort of taking the French political scene on its head. You had the discussions in Germany about the rise of the AfD, none of which were surprising, but still, I think, provided a shock to the political system to have these on black and white and really saw where voters moved in comparison to 2019 or the last national elections.
So Nicolai, during the course of our conversation, I'd certainly like to come back and talk about the implications at the national level with certainly France and Germany. But before we do that, let's stay at the European level. It's interesting to hear you say that the polling was spot on in some cases, but there was still some surprise in some of the state elections. Was there one factor that surprised you the most as you sort of were watching results come in?
I think what surprised me the most was probably the gains by the center-right EPP, the European People's Party. We expected them to stay roughly stable or lose a couple of seats, but they even increased their seats. They won the elections in quite a few of the EU member states. And this means that we had the shift to the right that a lot of us expected before the elections. But overall, the center-right EPP is now so strong that basically there will not be a possibility for a majority without it. Additionally, it does not need for a majority any votes from the far right, as was previously discussed before the election as one of the possibilities. And I think that even though it's just a couple of seats here and there, changed the narrative after the election. And then maybe a second point, which at least I didn't have on my radar, that there were quite a lot of regional changes. For instance, in Northern Europe, the populist and far-right parties did quite bad, even lost seats. And there we had a small revival of social democratic parties, so that overall the social democrats went from about 140 seats to 136. And we expected them to be some of the bigger losers. But overall, besides the losses in Germany, they actually remain somewhat stable. And I think taking these two together, at the end, we come to that conclusion that some have sort of said in the media, the center holds, despite sort of the high profile gains from the far right in Germany and France in particular. If you look at the center parties, they still command a majority in the European Parliament that will be able to elect the next leadership positions and also define policy for the next 5 years.
Mm-hmm. And these are, I mean, I think these are important distinctions to make, and we will also undoubtedly in our conversation come back to the role of the EPP and the fact that it is able to really call the shots in some senses moving forward, and what sort of implications that might have. You know, you touched on this a little bit, that these results are quite different from the results of 2019 or even from some of the recent national elections. How has the political landscape in Europe changed since the last European parliamentary election in 2019? Of course, back then there was not a war going on in Ukraine. It was pre-pandemic. But in terms of the political landscape, how have things evolved since 2019?
So I think the political narrative has really changed. If you think back to 2019, I don't know how strong it was in the United States, but in Europe, the elections in 2019 were really dominated by that Fridays for Future demonstrations all across Europe, a big focus on climate change as the #1 worry for many, especially younger EU citizens. And that also led to that Green Deal agenda that was core part of the last 5 years. And fast forward to this year, you already mentioned the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, but I think you also have to mention inflation, the rising cost of living, the rising cost of houses, and also a renewed discussion about migration in many EU member states. And I think that has really contributed to that shift to more right-wing forces, even if we look at the whole European Parliament, it's more on the center-right. And this means that we have, if we compare it basically back to 1979, we never had a European Parliament that was as right-wing as the new European Parliament is. Still, the majority will be in the center, but the shift within the center will be more to the center right than it ever has been. And I think this is really explained by the changed political climate that we have. And then maybe a final point on that. This also means that many incumbent governments found it hard to contest the European elections. So EU elections are still for many citizens a kind of second order election where they also judge their national government. And a lot of national governments now have in their sort of past the pandemic, the lockdown decisions, the high inflation, and are very unpopular. And you could see that with the exception maybe of Giorgia Meloni in Italy and Donald Tusk in Poland, most national governments and their parties lost in these European elections precisely because of the sort of many population being angry about the effects that the pandemic and the war has had on their personal economic status.
So there, I mean, obviously there are a couple points here that I'd like to unpack, but one of them is beginning where you sort of started, that if you think back to 2019, people were thinking about Fridays for Future, they were thinking about climate change issues, and that did not necessarily play as much of a role here. Sort of two related questions. One is, can you talk a little bit about how the Greens parties across Europe did, because they seem to have lost some traction. But also there were a number of countries, including Germany, where younger voters were able to take to the polls for the first time, 16 to 18-year-olds. How did that affect voting?
Yeah, so two interesting questions. First, on the Greens, overall, they were the ones who lost most significantly in addition to the Liberals. So from the center parties, the Greens and the Liberals were the biggest losers. Although the picture about the Greens is a little bit more differentiated in the sense they lost most in Germany and France. But they gained seats in a couple of Central and Eastern European countries. So the Green movement used to be a very Western European movement. and they sort of broadened their base to some countries in Central and Eastern Europe, but they lost in their core countries. And that meant overall they've lost around, I think that at the latest numbers, around 20 seats. And it will now be interesting whether they can still play a major role in the next European Parliament, as their votes will not necessarily be necessary for getting majorities in the European Parliament. And of course, they will fight hard to retain the Green Deal and some of the EU's climate ambition, and that will be harder for them as they are now a smaller force. But in a sense, they have been the victim of their own successes as they moved, sort of pushed the EU to that big Green Deal. And voters, rightly or wrongly, blamed some of the costs of that Green Deal on the Greens in particular, even though the Green Deal itself was supported by many other political forces in Europe. Now, on the younger voters, you have also a differentiated pictures, but I think what surprised many in Europe, but which should not have been a surprise anymore, is that young voters voted quite to a significant amount for far-right parties. So there used to be this idea that far-right parties would attract the support of old white men only. But this hasn't been the case for some time already. So if you look at the presidential elections in 2021 in France, Macron would have lost against Le Pen if you only looked at the young voters. And this is something that we see now also in many other member states, including in Germany, where the AfD scored second amongst younger voters. It was not their best voting brackets in terms of age, but it's still a change that they were quite successfully able via especially social media, TikTok and others, to reach out to young voters and get them to turn out for them at the European elections, which I think is sort of a change in how the European political scene also looks at young voters, where there was always maybe this caricature of young voters are always progressive, pro-green, climate policy interested. And now we have a bracket of young voters that is definitely turned away by too much political correctness in their view and is open to vote for center-right or far-right parties.
Of course, Europe had two waves of enlargement in 2004 and 2007, and then Croatia joined the European Union in 2014. And one of our viewers is curious whether there were any surprises or any significant shifts in some of these new member states of the European Union that are worth talking about and thinking about.
So I think there were a couple of interesting ones. The first was turnout. You mentioned in the beginning that turnout slightly rose. And that was also due to many, but not all, Central and Eastern European countries. Some of them used to have really abysmal turnout rates. So I remember Slovakia in 2014 had less than 20% turnout at the European elections. And now most of them had a rise in turnout. Poland was a small exception, but they had like 4 different elections in the last year, so there was some kind of election fatigue in Poland itself. But overall, in Central and Eastern Europe, we saw a rise in turnout, and I think this is positive. The second story that we can say is that Central and Eastern Europe, maybe for those in the center, quote unquote, saved the European Union, in the sense that this was the area where center-right and to a lesser extent center-left parties were most stable, while the big losses were in the old guard of member states like France and Germany. And so particularly the good result of the EPP comes from a lot of Central and Eastern European countries. In Poland, they topped the polls for the first time since I think 2015. Donald Tusk party was quite successful there. And so there is a story about Central and Eastern Europe to tell. And maybe the final point is, and we'll get to the leadership position afterwards, but there's now also a big movement towards getting somebody from Central and Eastern Europe into one of the core leadership positions, which happened in the past. Donald Tusk was, of course, president of the European Council, but it has been rare so far. And this is certainly will be one part of the discussion about who's going to lead the EU next, and where leadership can also come from Central and Eastern Europe, including on foreign policy and on Russia.
So picking up right there, I mean, particularly for these countries of Central and Eastern Europe, but also for Europe as a whole, what role did concerns over the war in Ukraine play in this election season, right? In the campaigns, but then also in the voting?
So I think we first have to say that the campaigns were still quite national, in the sense that it's one European election over 4 different days, but the rules are still slightly different between EU member states, and in many there's still a very national element around the campaign debate. That being said, there were some strands which basically were part of the conversation in most of the EU. The question of the rise of the far right was one thing, migration the other, but security was certainly far and above there in most member states, at least those who are somewhat close to Russia or Ukraine. And here the question really was, and how far can the EU also be a genuine security actor? Most of the people listening will know that the EU started as a peace project after the Second World War that was supposed to guarantee peace between its members by integration, but it's only in the last couple of years that there's been now a strong sort of conversation how the EU can guarantee security rather than just peace, security in this new, very competitive European security architecture. And much of that is down to NATO and national defense spending. So the EU plays more of a supportive role there. But there certainly is now starting sort of from the election campaign and now afterwards a conversation on how and where the EU should do more on defense by itself, how it can improve the development of military capabilities, and to some extent whether the EU should not invest itself, so by EU money into defense, which until now is very much a national area. And if we're in this transatlantic context, of course, the US election plays a big role there. The potential shadow of a shift in Washington, what we've already seen with for a long time the blockade of support for Ukraine in the US Congress played a role in these discussions before the European elections, where many EU and national leaders said, okay, we have to invest more in our defense, and we need to discuss and decide on where we should do it on a national level and what can we contribute within the EU field. And this will certainly be one of the priorities of the EU looking forward, not only, but certainly with one eye to what happens in the US in November.
And Nicolai, one can certainly see sort of hints of that when one thinks about some of those top positions, which I'd like to talk about now, because now, of course, there's also a conversation about having a defense commissioner, which would be a new position in that leadership rank. So it's interesting because generally it takes quite a few weeks after the election results come in for there to be real hardcore negotiations about the top jobs. And in days, we actually saw, not only some jockeying for the top positions, but on the sidelines of the G7 summit, we heard some reports from Emmanuel Macron, from Olaf Scholz about some of the leadership roles. And it seemed as if there was strong consensus around having Ursula von der Leyen serve a second term as European Commission President, having former Portuguese Prime Minister Antonio Costa serve as Council President, having Estonia's Prime Minister Kaja Kallas serve as the foreign policy head. And there was actually just a meeting yesterday where some people, going into that meeting thought we'd have some certainty today when we woke up. But that wasn't the case. That did not gel in quite the way that many people thought that it would. Can you talk to us a little bit about sort of the cast of characters in some of these top positions and the process for making decisions about who actually is in those leadership roles?
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack there. Maybe starting from the beginning, or the fundamentals. The EU is still sort of a hybrid between getting democratic legitimacy from the elected European Parliament, but it's still also an organization of member states where decision power rests with the national governments. And this is as much true about the leadership position as about anything else. And this means that, for instance, the Commission president is nominated by the heads of states and government by the European Council, so the big leaders like Macron, Scholz, Meloni, Tusk, and others, but has to be elected by a majority in the European Parliament, reflecting the results of the European Parliament elections. And so what you see now and over the coming weeks is basically a negotiation where these two factors come together. Who won the European Parliament elections and who can get a majority in the new European Parliament, but also what can the big players in the member states influence in that decision making. And I think the clarity of the election result gave some credence that for the Commission president, so the most important leadership position, there's really almost no alternative to Ursula von der Leyen. She was the lead candidate by the European People's Party, the EPP, that we already mentioned, not only gains seats, but is by far the largest group in the European Parliament, and has the largest group of national leaders behind it in the European Council. And there is no majority you can build in the European Parliament against the European People's Party. And so it's very likely that Ursula von der Leyen will be re-elected as Commission president. But for that, as I said, she needs to be sort of the first hurdle she needs to pass is get nomination by the heads of state and government, and there it's looking quite good. And then the second hurdle is the European Parliament, the majority, where the three groups of the center, the EPP, the European Social Democrats, and the Liberals, have around 400 seats. They need 361 for a majority, so she can even afford to lose a couple of her own party's parliamentarians, as on the EU level there's not this sort of core discipline as you might see on a national party, but she is quite safe. Where the discussion, I think, stumbled last night and might get a little bit tricky over the next couple of weeks, a couple of things. So the first one is what political program will be attached to von der Leyen? So in how far will she be, or will it be necessary for her to give concessions, for instance, on climate policy, on migration policy, or on security policy, as we just discussed? So, in how far to get elected will it be necessary for her to give in to pressures either from the member states or the political groups in the European Parliament? And then the second critical question is, will there be some space for the far right? So far, the groups of the center have always sort of divided up these posts between them. But now the far right not only gained in the European elections, but they also have now a couple of national governments led by far right politicians. Giorgia Meloni in Italy is to mention there, the Netherlands very soon, the Czech Republic kind of still falls under the category, but is quite close to the center right in many of these political ideas. But anyhow, the far right, or the more moderate bit of the far right, is basically saying we gain power. Now we also want a seat at the table. And they are no longer they are not necessary, as some expected, for a majority in the European Parliament. So that venue is out. But what we heard from last night is that Giorgia Meloni basically said we want a good portfolio for Italy, but also for my group, the European Conservatives and Reformers, so the National Conservative part of the far right. And the third point where it stumbled is, and I could sort of answer for a long time, so you have to stop me if I'm going too much into
this is great.
detail. The third part where it stumbled is that the EPP, the center-right, overreached to some extent. They said we want the Commission president, we want the European Parliament's president, but we also want part of the presidency of the European Council, which is more of a representative role, but it's elected for 2.5 years. And so they got the idea, okay, it goes to Costa, so the socialists, in the first 2.5 years, and we want the second 2.5 years, rather than just renewing Costa, and this was seen as overreach by the center-left groups, and they pushed back against that. And then the final piece of the puzzle, I mentioned that, and you alluded to it, Kaja Kallas, the Estonian Prime Minister, is much discussed for the role of High Representative, so the EU Foreign Minister. And she would fit in quite well. She comes from the liberal group. She comes from Central and Eastern Europe, but she's also very, very hawkish on Russia. She's very hawkish on China. And thus she is more hawkish than most of the EU member states. And so there is at least some pushback against her in how far countries who want not necessarily to go to Vladimir Putin and say, let's negotiate, but maybe say we need to leave some space for diplomatic advances. We have to be careful and calibrate our support for Ukraine in order not to provoke a wider war with NATO. And some of those are a little bit at least careful whether Kaja Kallas is the right choice. And this is sort of these 4 different layers to bring them together. The question of sort of the policy program, EPP overreach, the question of Kaja Kallas and whether there's a role and position for the National Conservatives. Those were the blocking point last night. Last word on that, I was personally not that surprised that we didn't get a deal immediately. It's part of the European game that you have these long negotiations, and if there's not a pressure to find a quick solution, there's rarely ever a quick solution at the EU level.
So, I mean, it's interesting that you say that, because I think that one of the factors that contributed to some hope that there would be a quick solution was the fact that Macron called for snap elections and dissolved the French Parliament, and that seemed to sort of speed up the process about the discussion about the top jobs. I think, for me at least, at first blush, it seemed as if having von der Leyen, supported by the EPP from one of the big European countries, and then having Social Democrat Costa from Portugal in the south, and having the liberal Kaja Kallas from the Baltics, was a good mix in terms of geography and political background, and gender, of course. And so at the surface, I think for many people, it looked like a good team and a good fit. But as you say, the devil is in the details, and there were a number of issues of concern by different groups that were involved in this. And so there's been a lot of sort of analysis this morning as to who actually sunk the deal, whether it was just the EPP for overreaching, as you suggested, whether it was Meloni's concern at how negotiations had gone. And so the situation is really far more complex, as you just described to us. But I guess the question that sort of remains for me is the next big sort of deadline in this discussion is the summit, which is planned for June 27th and June 28th. So that's coming up in just 10 days. And I'm curious whether you think that the far right groups, right, Meloni, Orban, Le Pen, up to now, they haven't been that organized and as concerted in how they've worked together. If they are able to align more closely, do you think that they could further impact or influence these negotiations over the top jobs?
So there are several aspects to this. So the first is maybe the timeline. There is a European Parliament plenary, so the first sort of where all the parliamentarians come together and take the first decisions in mid-July. And after that, the Parliament goes into recess and only meets again in September. And so I think for Brussels watcher, the real deadline was always the summit on the 28th of June, because if there's no nomination of the Commission President then, that means the vote can only happen in September. And so it was always planned. The meeting last night was only an informal dinner, so couldn't take any formal decisions anyway. So the real crunch point on that complex puzzle has to happen on the 27th, 28th anyway. And this is a quite hard deadline, because if that is missed, that means that the whole process of nominating the leadership goes into September, and I think everybody in the EU institutions wants to avoid that. The second point to unpack there is who is actually needed to take these decisions. And unlike a lot of other EU decisions, I would say quite wisely, those who've written the EU treaties made the decisions on nomination of the leadership position by qualified majority. And so individual member states can be outvoted. Viktor Orban and David Cameron famously voted against Jean-Claude Juncker in 2014. So that means at the end of the day, the levers to block the nomination processes are limited, in the sense that I think there's almost no chance that Viktor Orban will vote for Ursula von der Leyen, or if he would extract a very, very high price for it, but he can be outvoted. And so and the same is true about the European Parliament, where the far right is not necessary to get to a majority, because the center right did better than expected and the center left lost a little bit less than expected. And so to put that together, I think at least if we only look at the votes for getting the next leadership in place, the groups of the center can play the game without adhering to the far right. But there was also another part of your question, and that was the organization of the far right itself.
Yeah.
And this I think is still a very interesting dynamic, in the sense that EU far-right parties are notoriously split. They are split on issues, for instance, on how to relate towards Russia, between very transatlantic anti-Russia and very Russia-friendly anti-Western on the other side. They're also split by personalities. Meloni now is a strong player in the national conservative spectrum, and she doesn't necessarily want to share that power with Le Pen and Orban. Le Pen has just thrown out the AfD out of her group for fear of being too tainted by their lurch to the further extreme. But you're right, if you just look at the pure question of power, they would have an incentive to move together and form a joint far-right group, which would still not be the largest group in the European Parliament, but which could be a significant force. My assessment is nevertheless that the split will continue. On the one hand, because of these ideological and personal differences. But on the other hand, there is a part of the far right, this national conservative spectrum, which wants to get into the center. And Meloni is the perfect example of that. She, whatever you can discuss about her sort of post-fascist party, she has established herself as a normal interlocutor on the European and also international level, dealing with Biden, with Scholz, with Macron, and as a perfectly accepted negotiation partner. And she aims to do that also in the European Parliament. So take her National Conservative Party, the ECR, these European Conservatives and Reformers, and make them open towards deals with the center-right. This will not necessarily now happen on the jobs and the leadership, but it might still happen on policy content, on future economic policy, on less ambitious climate policy that focuses more on economic competitiveness, on some aspects of migration policy. And if she were to work with the likes of Le Pen and Orban, she would basically retoxify her brand. And this is why, at least my assessment on the European level, this part of the far right, so this national conservative spectrum, has no interest for now to merge into a super group that would reduce their chances to get into the main negotiation room. And this is incidentally, I think, why Meloni was so frustrated from everything that we're hearing from last night, because she wanted to get into that negotiation room with the center right. And this may be my last point of that. Certainly a strategic question for the center right is how much to engage with the likes of Meloni, because I think they want to engage her also to split the far right. They've laid down 3 criteria on which to work together with the far right. They say they have to be pro-Europe, pro-Ukraine, and pro-rule of law. And these criteria are for now fitted by Meloni. But if they completely reject her and say, okay, we continue to work with the groups of the center, she might at the end of the day maybe even be incentivized to say, okay, stuff it. If you're not working with me, then I'll work with Le Pen and Orban, since I don't get into the negotiation room anyway. So it's a tricky strategic situation for the center right.
And a tricky strategic situation, but also a very tight timeline from everything that you've said, right? If really the June 27th, 28th date is the real deadline, because otherwise these decisions won't be able to be made in a timely manner. It is not just the top leadership jobs that are in play, but also the distribution of commissioner roles to each of the member states, and making sure that it's clear who is in the senior leadership roles. And of course, there's a new position at play as well, which is this defense commissioner, which we talked about very, very briefly. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you think about the EU having a defense commissioner. In one of the reports that I read, Radek Sikorski, the Polish foreign minister's name, was floated as a potential defense commissioner. But there was another report that said that he absolutely did not want to do that job. Do you think that that job is necessary?
So several points to that. So first, it's at least legally a 2-stage process, in the sense that the European Parliament first elects a Commission president, and then over the summer, the member states make their proposals for commissioners, and the Commission president then sort of elected takes all the names that she, in this case, probably will have gotten, and makes a team out of that and distributes the roles that these get. And then each of them get a hearing in the European Parliament, and the European Parliament usually kicks out 1 or 2 of them because they say you're not suitable, and then votes on the whole team by October, November-ish, so well into the second half of the year. But what you rightly say, as has been in the past, the negotiation with the Commission President, the member states already try to pin down some of the major leadership roles in the Commission. So in 2019, you had sort of von der Leyen and below herself, basically two major commissioners, with Timmermans for the Green Deal and Vestager for everything digital. And the digital transformation. And this time there's a lot of talk about this defense commissioner role. I'd say I would want to do expectation management. So this is not a defense commissioner in the sense of a defense minister which organizes the defense of the European Union. I think the better sort of description would be a defense industrial commissioner who will try to get the cooperation of European defense industry going and support sort of the condensation of defense industry and maybe some joint procurement. There will probably also be space added to that commissioner's role, so much more an economic defense portfolio rather than somebody who would basically be in any shape or form in command of divisions or organize sort of any kind of sort of practical defense. And once we have that down and say, okay, this is the expectation, I think there is a real need for that. Europe will need to invest much more in defense. Most of EU member states raising their defense spending quite significantly. Just yesterday, we had new figures of NATO. The sort of in GDP terms, the biggest spender on defense is now Poland. Beyond the United States, and you could see sort of in comparison to 2014, basically except one, all current EU member states raised their defense spending. Countries like Germany are now above 2%, and so there's a lot of money being spent, but recent analysis showed that where's this money going? To the United States. 85% of new European defense money is going to the United States or South Korea. And even in this transatlantic context, I think it's okay to say that there's necessity to integrate European defense industry and see that some of that defense spending and also the capabilities to sort of scale up defense production as well. And therefore, what I think I lost you shortly. Can you still hear me?
You're back again. You froze briefly.
Yeah. Okay. So, but sort of to close that point, there is going to be this need to integrate European defense industry, and I think this is what this commissioner will need to be doing. So rather not going to the battalions, but going to the arms production manufacturers. And this is, I think, also a reason why I was somewhat skeptical of that Sikorski idea, because the more likely candidate should be somebody from one of the major arms producing EU member states, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, Sweden to some extent. Poland still has, despite its high defense spending now, a quite small defense industry. And I think this is where the focus of that new commissioner will going to be.
So one of our viewers is curious whether you think that commissioner would be in place by the 9th of July for the NATO summit and anniversary celebration in Washington. Obviously, the symbolism of that would be enormous, but it sounds as if the timeline would be incredibly tight, if not impossible.
No, it's practically impossible. So what will happen is that the vote on the Commission President-elect will be, or nominee will be on the, I think, 17th, 18th of July. So already after the NATO summit, and only you might have sort of somebody sort of politically rumored to be in that position. But the vote will in either case only happen in October or November. So as I explained, sort of first you have the Commission President, and then sort of the Commission President-elect puts together their team, and you have these I don't think you have a similar system in the United States where there's really in-depth hearing of all the commissioner nominees in the European Parliament, and defense will be one of the very interesting ones. But really the vote and the official sort of confirmation only happens when the full team is complete in the fall. It might be only by the time that the US actually makes a decision on who's going to be the next US president.
Yeah. So, I mean, this fall remains interesting, and there are a lot of open factors that we will be following closely. Several of our viewers have posed questions about sort of the broader implications of the election results with a more right-leaning parliament. To what degree do you think that EU politics will shift? I mean, could there be a shift in direction of the European Union moving forward? And one person in specific asked what the elections will mean for relationships with countries like the US, China, Russia. It might be too early to tell, especially given our elections as well in the fall. But it would be interesting to hear your thoughts on how this right of center parliament might shift European politics.
So I think the important point is that it will shift policies to the center right, but not the far right on the European level. So as I said, the EPP is now the player which really can control to some extent in the European Parliament, because in the previous European Parliament, the EPP was already the strongest group, but there was a possibility to have majorities to the left of the EPP. And that happened sometimes on some of the climate decisions, on the supply chain laws, on some of the social policies. And in the views of many of the EPP, also Ursula von der Leyen made too many concessions to the center left and the Green parties with the Green Deal. And so the shift, I think you will see more on the European level, is really less of a sort of US or UK style from one side of the political spectrum to the other, but more sort of a gradual in the center, more to the center right. And areas where I expect that to happen is sort of the balance between climate change and economic competitiveness, where the slider will go a little bit more towards competitiveness, agriculture, more business-friendly decisions, and maybe a little bit more time for adaptations, but not necessarily a full rollback of climate policy. In migration, but there I'd argue the sort of hardliners on migration have already won the normative debate in the EU, especially amongst center-right parties, but increasingly also amongst center-left parties. There will be more on sort of harder border controls, externalization of asylum procedures, which will happen there. But I think on economic policy, there will be a bigger focus on less regulation and more competitiveness. So this deregulation agenda will happen more on the European level. Where I don't expect such a big shift is on foreign policy, precisely because already the at least support for Ukraine is quite strong amongst the mainstream groups, but also because that part of the far right that is more that could work with the center forces is the one that is transatlantic, Russia critical, pro-Ukraine, very critical on China. And we made an analysis on voting behavior in the European Parliament in the spring over the last 5 years. And there parties like Meloni, but also the Polish Peace Party voted with the majority on foreign policy issues on almost all of the votes. And there I really would not expect a big shift to come from the European level. Where I think a major shift could happen is, of course, the national level. And I don't know whether we can talk about that a little bit more, but the sort of big sort of earthquake from these elections were certainly in France, and we'll see what happens there. And to some extent, that might have a bigger impact on some of the EU policy if we get a big shift to the far right for the French Parliament. That is by all the polls that we see, much bigger than the shift that we have seen in the EU overall.
So that, I mean, we only have a few minutes left, as you rightly observed, but I think it makes sense for us to end by talking a little bit about the consequences on the national level. Certainly for me, the biggest surprise on June 9th, as the election results were coming in and the initial dust was settling, was Macron's announcement that he was going to dissolve the French Parliament and call elections just a few weeks later. And of course, the first round of those elections will be happening just at the time that the EU is meeting to decide on the commissioner at the end of June. And you know, these election results have, well, and I think it's fair to say that Macron is taking quite a gamble with this path that he's decided to proceed. So to proceed down. So these are huge consequences for France. You talked a little bit earlier about the success of the AfD, the Alternative for Germany party in Germany, and sort of the move to the far right, and really the lack of confidence in the current governing parties in the traffic light coalition. So in the two big countries in Europe, you're seeing these elections have a significant impact on the governing parties. As we sort of draw to a close here, it would be great to get sort of your top level insights into what this means for France moving forward, what this means for Germany, and perhaps what the issues are that we should be following in the next few weeks as things crystallize a little bit more.
So I think the situation, despite far-right gains in the two countries, are quite different. The danger in Germany, in my point of view, is stasis and paralysis of the government. There is no chance for any kind of foreseeable future for the far-right AfD getting into the German government. They ended up the European elections at a little bit above 15%, but they were quite strong in Eastern Germany. And we have a couple of Länder elections coming up. But the big point was that the national government was weakened. All of the three parties lost. But the alternative, if the next German elections come around the fall of 2025 or earlier, is not a far-right government, but a CDU center-right-led government. And the danger is more that the German government will look even more inwards and will be in quite a strong sort of internal struggle to get anything done and is weakened on the European level. Now, in France, the situation is different. There, in the snap elections, the voting system is a little bit complicated, but there is chance that the Rassemblement National, so the party of Marine Le Pen and Bardella, who was the lead candidate in these elections, could well either become the majority in the French Parliament in a couple of weeks, or be so big that you have basically a big far right, a big far left, and a very small center, and basically nothing in between to get anything done. And so for France, even though Macron will stay himself president until 2027, the danger is now that you either have a shared government with the far right, and the real far right, which I think is still more extreme that Meloni is in Italy, or you have a parliament that is so blocked that basically nothing can get through. And neither of these scenarios is very good for the EU. And if you add that together and you have a weak French president, a weak German chancellor, then that means that the political center of the EU is quite heavily weakened. And this is what I mean, that the effects on the national level might be more adverse than the changes in the European Parliament, where the center broadly but with very strong repercussions for Germany. And this is, if you ask on what we need to look out for France, the elections will happen in 2 rounds. Mm-hmm. And the big sort of decision, and I think this is the only 2 scenarios which are realistic for now at the moment, is Will we see a real far-right government, which could then share power with Macron, making life very, very difficult on the EU level? Or will we see a blockaded parliament? Maybe very last point, and this is, I think, interesting also for an American audience. What we're not talking about is a kind of Frexit, French exit from the EU scenario, because what happened over the last couple of years, that Le Pen in particular moved away from any kind of ideas from leaving the EU or the Eurozone, and has changed tactics from wanting to leave the EU to wanting to take over the EU. And wanting to take over the French parliament. And so I don't think it will be a very different France. It will be a shock for the European Union. And I still personally, and I think everybody in the sort of EU bubble is still trying to come to terms with what it would actually mean for policy areas, representation, and so on. But what we're not expecting at the moment is sort of an attempt to break the EU apart, but more of a sort of creeping, trying to change the EU. And this is maybe, I'll end with that, the Hungarian presidency has just today unveiled its motto for the next 6 months. And they used "Make Europe Great Again."
Yeah.
And I think it's part of the sort of strategy of European far-right parties to no longer say we want to dismantle the EU, but we want a sort of a fortress Europe, a Europe that defends sort of that we remake in a nationalistic image. And this is, I think, the battle to come in the EU institutions, but also in the member states.
So maybe one final question as you try to understand Emmanuel Macron. Neither of these scenarios that you've described of cohabitation or of the blocked parliament are particularly appealing, and both have huge risks associated with them. What do you think Macron was trying to get out of making this decision to dissolve the parliament and call for new elections?
That's very, very hard to say. So what we knew beforehand, that new elections as such weren't that big of a surprise. There were already rumors that Macron was planning new elections for the fall. Precisely, the current parliament is already blocked. He doesn't have his own majority, has big troubles getting budgets through parliament. And the conversation, as far as I'm hearing in Paris, was already about new elections in the fall. And he sort of pushed that forward. And I find it quite hard to understand why he did it at a moment where the Assemblée Nationale had the political momentum. The explanations we are getting from Paris that it's a big gamble to either try to push the French to choose between sort of the far right and his more center liberal alternative. But what we're actually seeing, that his party is kind of dissolving, and that the center, the far left and the center left group together and are more successful in organizing for this election campaign than Macron's own party. And so that seemed to be backfiring. And the second explanation that is being given is that he wants to sort of push responsibility into the hands of the far right in order to get in 2027 the French to vote for a center or center-left politicians. But that as well would be a huge gamble. So I have trouble giving you an explanation that I personally can say, okay, that really makes sense. Those are the different explanations that French watchers are giving us. But in any case, it's a huge gamble, and it's also a destabilizing factor for the EU, regardless of which of the two scenarios come out. There's a sort of small third scenario that the center-left, far-left does better than expected. But that also would come with some challenges for Macron, maybe not as much as a full-out far-right win, but none of the scenarios that are realistic at the moment seem very appealing.
Well, obviously, lots to watch in the weeks ahead. But Nicolai, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to share your insights with us This has been incredibly thoughtful and thought-provoking. I certainly learned a lot. I think many of our viewers did as well. And I hope that maybe at some point in the next few weeks or months, we can continue the conversation, because obviously this will be a developing story in the weeks ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you to everybody listening, and you, Stephen, for organizing it.
A pleasure. Take care.